The eighth lecture in Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. Sabbatianism and Mystical Heresy. 1. The development of Jewish mysticism from the time of the Spanish Exodus onwards has been singularly uniform and free from cross-currents. There is only one main line. The catastrophic events of that period led directly to the rise of the new school of Sabbatianism, whose thoughts, as we have seen, centered round certain problems, created or become visible through that great cataclysm. We have also seen that in dealing with them, that the school evolved a completely new doctrine. It seems to me that this new doctrine, as it was formulated by Luria and finally adopted by Jewish theology, represents a particularly accurate expression of the outlook which gradually became predominant in Jewry after the turn of the century. These new ideas combine a mystical interpretation of the fact of exile with an equally mystical theory of the path to redemption. The old spirit of mystical contemplation is enriched by the new element of messianic fervor, with its apocalyptic dream of an end to the period of suffering and degradation. The spread of Lurianic Kabbalism, with its doctrine of tikkun, of the restitution of cosmic harmony through the earthly medium of a mystically elevated Judaism. This doctrine could not but lead to an explosive manifestation of all those forces to which it owed its rise and its success. If it be true that the Kabbalah gave expression to the prevalent mood of the age, then nothing seems more natural than that there should have been the closest correspondence between the historical conditions which molded the fate of the Jewish people in this epoch of Kabbalistic ascendancy and the inner development of Jewish religious thought, including all of its new forms, a people which had suffered from the tribulations which exile and persecution could bring, and which at the same time had developed an extremely sensitive consciousness of life, actually lived between the poles of exile and redemption, needed little to take the final step to Messianism. The appearance of Sabbatianism and Nathan of Gaza precipitated this step by liberating the latent energies and potentialities which had gradually accumulated during the generations immediately preceding them. The eruption of the volcano, when it came, was terrific. It is not my purpose here to describe the swift rise and the sudden collapse of the Sabbatian movement in 1665 and 1666, from Sabbatianism's proclamation of his messianic mission to his renunciation of Judaism and adoption of Islam when he was led before the Turkish Sultan. Because of the riots and stuff he caused. I'm not primarily concerned with the biography of the Messiah and his prophet, Nathan of Gaza, nor with the details of the tremendous religious mass movement which spread like wildfire through the entire diaspora, already prepared, as it were, for such an event by the influence of the new Kabbalism. Suffice it to say that very large numbers of people were swept on a tide of emotion and underwent the most extravagant forms of self-inflicted penitence, the like of which, we are told by the contemporaries, never were seen before, nor will be again until the true redemption comes. But hand in hand with the penitence, there also went boundless rejoicing and enthusiasm, for at last there seemed to be visible proof of the sufferings of 1600 years had not been in vain. Before redemption had actually come, it was felt by many to have become reality. An emotional upheaval of immense force took place among the mass of the people, and for an entire year men lived on a new life which for many years remained their first glimpse of deeper spiritual reality. The course which events took is described in every book on Jewish history, though in many details the story still awaits critical revision. My object here is to stress those aspects of the Sabbatian movement which are wholly or partially neglected in the historical literature, and those which, through misunderstanding or other causes, have remained entirely in the dark without a proper appreciation of these aspects of the matter, it is impossible to understand the true nature of this grandiose, though abortive attempt to revolutionize Judaism from within, its significance for the history of Judaism and for Jewish mysticism in particular. Part 2. This task, however, cannot be undertaken without saying a few words about the personalities of the two original leaders of the movement and their place in the first outbreak and subsequent development. This is all the more needed because in this, as in so many other matters discussed in the course of these lectures, I am bound to take a view which differs to a considerable extent from the customary one. What then was the basic trait of Sabbatianism's personality, and how are we to judge his individual contribution to the movement? In particular, how are we to interpret his relation to Nathan of Gaza, his subsequent prophet? Well, that's not how it works, but the apostolic mode has certainly convinced a lot of people, right? To these questions, the only documents available in print until recent years have not been permitted a definite answer. Those which throw most light on the subject have not hitherto been published, and in their absence it has often been impossible to form a correct impression even of published writings. In these circumstances, undue weight has been given to the testimony of persons who are not intimately acquainted with the leaders of the movement. It is therefore scarcely astonishing that, where the scholars had failed, poets, dramatists, and other masters of fiction have tried to complete the picture by drawing on the resources of their imagination. Yet there are in our possession not a few highly important documents, some personal and others theological, emanating from the closest circle of Sabbatianism's followers, which throw an entirely unexpected light on all these questions. An analysis of all the sources to which I have had access yields the following main conclusions. It was not Sabbatianism himself who, by his appearance and his constant activity over a number of years, finally succeeded, in the teeth of persecution, in founding the movement which bears his name. True, without him it would have been unthinkable in this form, but his own unaided activity would never have sufficed to bring it about. It was the awakening of Nathan of Gaza to his supposed prophetic mission which set the whole train of events in motion. The role of this brilliant and ardent youth, who at the time of the inception of the movement was only 20 years old, has scarcely been understood and now appears in a totally different light. Even before the critical date of 1665 of the Common Era, Sabbatianism, who lived from 1625 to 1676, appears to have regarded himself in certain movements as the Messiah, and to have made occasional references to this conviction. But no one, literally no one, took this claim seriously. To be precise, nobody, including his admirers in Smyrna, gave the faintest sign between 1648, when there appears to have been for the first time a slight scandal about him, and in 1665, of knowing anything about the existence and personality of the true Messiah of God. The explanation of this fact is very simple and provides the key to the understanding of this tragic Messiah. Sabbatianism was physically a sick man. To some extent, this truth has, of course, been suspected before. People have talked of paranoia or hysteria, but a mass of documentary evidence now available shows that his affliction was, in fact, of a somewhat different nature. He was constitutionally a manic depressive. That is to say, he belonged to a type whose lack of mental balance displays itself in alternate fits of deepest gloom and most uncontrollable exuberance and exaggerated joy, periods of profound depression and melancholia constantly alternated in him with spasms of maniacal exaltation, enthusiasm, and euphoria, separated by intervals of a more normal state of mind. What is known of his character does not give the faintest indication of paranoia, but on the other hand, it hardly lacks a single trait of manic depressive psychosis, as described in the standard handbooks of psychiatry. The evidence of his biographers permits us to conclude that he showed the first traits of this mental affliction between his 16th and 20th year. Now it is of special importance for our understanding of his character that this mental illness is distinguished from all others by the fact that it does not lead to the decomposition and destruction of the human personality, and in particular does not affect the intelligence. Actually, the term illness is used only in a single and very eloquent testimony written by one of his most important followers who retained his faith in him to the end, Samuel Gandor, who in the summer of 1665 was sent from Egypt to Gaza in order to investigate the events which had taken place there. This enthusiastic follower of Sabbatianism and traveling companion in Nathan has left us the following description of his master. It is said of Sabbatianism that for 15 years he has been bowed down by the following affliction. He is pursued by a sense of depression which leaves him no quiet moment and does not even permit him to read without his being able to say what is the nature of this sadness which has come upon him. Thus he endures it until the depression departs from the spirit, when he returns with great joy to his studies, and for many years already he has suffered from this illness, and no doctor has found a remedy for it. But it is one of the sufferings which are inflicted by heaven. The same letter contains a description of an incident during the night before the feast of Shavuot in 1665, when Sabbatianism was suddenly overcome by a profound depression of the kind just described. Similar, clear, and incontrovertible evidence exists for the state of manic excitement, which alternated with these attacks of depression. The Sabbatians later on no longer refer to these varying states of consciousness as the effects of illness. In their view, they represent certain states of mind induced by heavenly power, for which they employ theological terms, including novel ones of their own making, corresponding in the closest possible manner to the terms depression and exaltation. Their writings refer to a periodic alternation between a state of illumination and one of fall or abandon, an enthusiastic stand on the highest steps, and a depth of extreme spiritual poverty and misery. The accounts of the manic phase, of which by far the most illuminating comes from Sabbatianism himself, supply the key to the understanding of the role which his mental affliction had in the formation of his character, for they reveal nothing less than the ideational content of his mania. The truth for which they lay bare is strange enough, and its importance for the faith of the Sabbatian movement can hardly be overrated. Sabbatianism, the Kabbalistic ascetic and devotee, feels impelled under the influence of his maniac enthusiasm to commit acts which run counter to religious law. Well, that's where you end up with schizophrenia is not just being emotional or something like that. It's, that the whatever state a person is in has led them to diverge from, physical reality. A latent antinomianism is discernible in these acts, harmless enough at first, to which the Sabbatians gave the restrained but significant name Maasim Zarim, strange or paradoxical actions. Only the vaguest of guesses are possible concerning the origin of this irrepressible inclination to commit bizarre and anti-halakhic acts. Well, if it's not the law itself, maybe it's not so antinomian, is it? It's possible that some light is shed on the matter by the evidence supplied many years later by Moses ben Hiro, one of Sabbatianism's fellow students in Smyrna, concerning the Kabbalistic books which Sabbatianism had studied at the time. According to Ben Hiro, whom it is difficult to credit with wholesale fabrication of the story, Sabbatianism had read in his younger years only the Zohar and the book Kana. Of the latter, a work written in the 14th century, I have already indicated in a previous lecture that it reveals the same curious combinations of pious devotion and mystical reverence for the halakha. with veiled but sometimes very radical criticism of its precepts, which subsequently was personified, as it were, in Sabbatianism. Its various elements may be said to have come into open conflict with in the Sabbatian movement after the apostasy of the alleged Messiah. It may be that at the time when his influence first began to take possession of him, he was under the influence of this book, and that it left its imprint on the ideational content of his mania. With the doctrine of the Lurianic school, he appears to have concerned himself only at a latter date, although from all we know, it seems that his way of life was modeled on the ascetic principles of the Kabbalists of Safed. Solomon ben Abraham Laniado of Aleppo, an enthusiastic Sabbatian even after the apostasy of the Messiah, relates in a letter to Kurdistan what he was himself told by Sabbatianism when the latter passed through Aleppo in the late summer of 1665. Since 1648, the Holy Spirit and a great illumination had come over him. It was in his practice to pronounce the name of God in accordance with its letters, and to commit various strange acts, because it seemed to him that to act in this way was right for many reasons, and for purposes of acts of tikkun, which he proposed to carry out. And, well, if the letter of the law isn't as restrictive as the interpretation of the law, that seems a good enough reason. Like it says, don't use God's name secularly. It doesn't say don't use it, or, that sort of stuff. But those who saw him did not understand these matters, and he was like a fool in their eyes, and frequently our teachers in the Holy Land punished him for his wicked actions, which were far removed from common sense, so that he was compelled to part company with other people and to wander into the desert, and sometimes he was overcome by a great depression, but at other times he saw something of the glory of the Shekinah. Often, too, God tried him with great temptations, and he overcame them all. Laniado even asserts that when the illumination had passed from him, he was like a normal man and regretted the strange things he had done, for he no longer understood the reason as he had understood it when he committed them. Here, then, we have a clear description of Sabbatianism's state of mind, of the temptations to which he was subjected in his fits of depression. A great deal is said, especially in the writings of Nathan of Gaza, and we are told that they were of a demonic and erotic character. In brief, we have before us a man who felt himself pursued by demons during periods of melancholic depression, which exposed him to a severe physical and mental strain, who above all was the helpless victim of these forces. On the other hand, he shared with others the same psychical type, others of the same psychical type who were like him, men of a remarkable moral or intellectual level, the gift of a strong personal suggestive power over others. This personal magnetism, however, was bound up with his states of exaltation and did not survive them. Incidentally, his intellectual qualities, although fully developed, were by no means out of the ordinary. He has left no writings, and what is more important, he is not credited with a single unforgettable word, epigram, or speech. As a Kabbalist and a scholar, he does not appear to have raised himself above mediocrity. The emotional side of his character was more fully developed. He was unusually musical, fond of singing and of listening to song. During his imprisonment in the fortress of Gallipoli in the summer of 1666, of the Common Era, he was almost constantly surrounded by musicians, and the singing of the psalms, for which he had a special fondness, moved him easily and deeply. But his truly original characteristic is, without any doubt, to be found in the peculiarity of his mania, the commission of antinomian acts, which in a state of exaltation he appears to have regarded as sacramental actions. That was his specific trait, and that was also his specific contribution to the Sabbatian movement, in which he played, on the whole, a fairly passive part, for it was his particularity which gave its special character to the movement from the moment when he had first been recognized as a religious authority. The law which dominated this development was the law of his own personality, though it was left to Nathan of Gaza to discover it in him and to formulate it in conscious terms. In his state of illumination, he was the living archetype of the paradox of the holy sinner, and it may well be that, without his being able to express it, the image of an act of tikkun through the infringement of the holy law was before his eyes in these exalted states of mind, and this, and nothing else, is the true heritage of Sabbatai Tzvi, the quasi-sacramental character of antinomian actions, which here always take the form of a ritual, remained a shibboleth of the movement, and not least in its more radical offshoots. In his normative state, the Sabbatian is anything but an antinomian. The performance of such acts is a rite, a festive action of an individual, or a whole group, something out of the ordinary, greatly disturbing, and born from the deep stirring of emotional forces. Rasputin, Aleister Crowley. Perhaps we wouldn't have figures like that if it wasn't for Sabbatai Tzvi going around causing the problems that he did, right? Thus, Sabbatai Tzvi wandered through the world for years without friends or real followers, and without doing anything for the furtherance of the messianic aspirations which dominated him in rare moments of high exaltation. Had it not been for Nathan of Gaza, he would undoubtedly have remained one of the many anonymous enthusiasts of his generation, who in the years after the great catastrophe of Khmelnytsky, of the Khmelnytsky persecution of 1648, entertained vague dreams of messianic vocation without anybody paying any attention to them. It was a turning point in his life that he should have settled in Jerusalem in 1662. During the first 2 years of his stay there, Nathan of Gaza, who lived from 1644 to 1680, at that time a young student of the Talmud, which is a combination of Midrash and Gemara, right? Cannot have failed to see a good deal of Sabbatai Tzvi, already approaching 40, and doubtless the subject of much gossip in the small Jewish community of the town, even in the absence of close personal relations between them, from which there exists no proof. The personality of Sabbatai Tzvi must have made a deep impression on the sensitive and susceptible young man who was then between 17 and 19. In the final and decisive awakening of the prophetic mood in Nathan, Sabbatai Tzvi, who was at that time on a mission in Egypt, had no part. Nathan has told the story himself in a hitherto unpublished letter dated in the year 1667, from which I quote the following passage. I studied the Torah and purity until I was 20 years of age, and I carried out the great tikkun, which Isaac Luria prescribes for everyone who has committed great faults. Although, praise be to God, I have not advertently committed any sins, nevertheless I carried it out, and in case my soul be sullied from an earlier stage of transmigration. When I had attained the age of 20, I began to study the book of Zohar and some of the Lurianic writings, but he who comes to purify himself receives the aid of heaven, and thus he sent me some of his holy angels and blessed spirits, and revealed to me many of the mysteries of the Torah. In that same year, my force having been stimulated by the visions of the angels and the blessed souls, I was undergoing a long fast in the week after the feast of Purim, having now locked myself in holiness and purity in a separate room and completed the morning prayer under many tears. The Spirit came over me, my hair stood on end, and my knees shook, and I saw the Merkabah, and I saw visions of God all day long and all night. Of God or from God? If it's at the end of the word, the al or the yah, or I don't know what word. It'd be interesting to know the actual words used. And I was vouchsafed true prophecy, like any other prophet, as the voice spoke to me and began with the words, "Thus speaks the Lord." And it depends on what word they mean by Lord, and it turns out Yahweh comes from a couple ancient Egyptian terms that were used to refer to actually a number of entities like the ones that we call Ra and Thoth and Osiris, and I don't know how many others, but same root meaning, God is a noun and verb sort of thing, but yeah. And with the utmost clarity my heart perceived towards whom my prophecy was directed, i.e. towards Sabbatianism, and until this day I have never yet had so great a vision, but it remained hidden in my heart, until the Redeemer revealed himself in Gaza and proclaimed himself the Messiah. Only then did the angel permit me to proclaim what I had seen. How then did Sabbatianism come to proclaim himself as the Messiah in Gaza? The answer is as simple as it is startling. When Sabbatianism, who was then in Egypt, learned from a letter sent by Samuel Gondor that an Illuminate had appeared in Gaza, who disclosed to everyone the secret root of his soul and the particular tikkun of which his soul stood in need, and he abandoned his mission and went also to Gaza in order to find a tikkun and peace for his soul. I consider this to be the most interesting sentence in the history of Sabbatianism. Thus, when the story of Nathan's illumination spread, Sabbatianism came to him, not as the Messiah or in accordance with some secret understanding, but in order to find peace for his soul. To put it plainly, he came as a patient to a doctor of the soul. We know from Laniado's letter that precisely at this time in Egypt he had come into one of his normal periods and was troubled about his transgressions. He sought a cure for his psychosis, and only then was he was he convinced by Nathan by virtue of the latter's prophetic vision, in which, as he discloses in another context, he had also seen the figure of Sabbatianism of the authenticity of his messianic mission. It was Nathan who dispelled his doubts and revealed up him, after they had wandered together for several weeks through the holy places of Palestine to proclaim himself the Messiah. Nathan represents a most unusual combination of character traits. If the expression be permitted, he was at once the John the Baptist and the Paul of the new Messiah. Surely a very remarkable figure. He had all the qualities which one misses in Sabbatianism: tireless activity, originality of theological thought, and abundant protective power and literary ability. He proclaims the Messiah and blazes the trail for him. At the same time, he is by far the most influential theologian of the movement. He and his successor, the former Morano Abraham Miguel Cardozo, are the great theologians of classical Sabbatianism, that is to say, of a many-colored heretical movement within Jewish mysticism. Nathan does not himself practice antinomianism. He interprets it. He raises an indefinable state of exaltation with its euphoria, which manifests itself in absurd, bizarre, and sacrilegious actions, to the rank of a sacred act in which a sublime reality becomes manifest. The state of the new world of Tikkun, the meeting of these two personalities, made the Sabbatian movement. The great historical force of this new messianism was born on the day on which Nathan discovered that Sabbatianism, this curious sinner, ascetic, and saint who had occasionally dreamed of his messianic mission, was indeed the Messiah, and having discovered him, made him the symbol of a movement, and himself became its standard bearer. Now, there's certain things that psychologically can explain why such a dream would be produced from oneself after encountering all this, but thus, from the moment of its appearance long before the apostasy of this so-called Messiah, the theology of Sabbatianism was already conditioned by the needs to furnish a mystical interpretation of the personal peculiarities and the strange and paradoxical traits in the character and actions of Sabbatianism. His manias and depressions received a Kabbalistic interpretation, and in particular, the figure of Job is constantly treated by Nathan from the very beginning as the prototype of the personality of his Messiah. There still exist a few manuscripts of a highly remarkable little book written by Nathan under the title Derush ha-Taninim, Treatise on the Dragons, in the form of a commentary to a Zoharic passage on the mystery of the great dragon that lieth in the midst of the rivers of Egypt, in Ezekiel 29:3. In this treatise, which was written during Sabbatianism's imprisonment in Gallipoli at a time when no one even dreamed of the apostasy of the Messiah, there are as yet no suggestions of a downright heretical character. The writer develops his ideas in a form which nowhere conflicts with the tenets of traditional religion or with the principles of Lurianic Kabbalism, but already in this book we find him expounding new thoughts in his doctrine of the Messiah, for which there is no parallel in Agadic homiletics or the Lurianic Kabbalist. Luria defines the appearance of the Messiah as the consummation of the tikkun, but in his theory, no special place is reserved for the question of the root of the Messiah's soul. He does not raise the problem of the probable fate of his soul before he makes its appearance in the world and fulfills its task. The new step taken by Nathan consists in linking this question with the traditional ideas of Lurianic Kabbalism. Now, the Lurianic Kabbalist and the Agadic thing, there was a lot of response to Christianity. And rather than Messiah being a role that many people had in tonic, and perhaps maybe that would pick up at another time, it was like the Messiah is going to come or something. And it's like, that's, whether or not that's the case, that there's only one more to be, it's, not only does it not have that divine incarnation stuff attached to it, it just doesn't match up in a whole bunch of ways. According to Nathan, there exists a certain relationship between the Messiah and the course of all those intrinsic processes of which I have spoken in the last lecture. Tsum, Shavara, and Tikkun. In the beginning of the cosmic process, Ein Sof withdrew his light into himself, and there arose that primal space in the center of Ein Sof in which all the worlds take birth. This primal space is full of formless, hylic forces. The Klepoth, the process of the world, consists in giving shape to these formless forces and making something out of them. As long as this has not been done, the primal space, and in particular its lower part, is the stronghold of darkness and evil. It is the depth of the great abyss in which the demonic powers have their abode. When, following the breaking of the vessels, some sparks of the divine light radiating from Ein Sof in order to create forms and shapes in the primal space, fell into the abyss. There also fell the soul of the Messiah, which was embedded in that original divine light. Since the beginning of the creation, this soul has dwelt in the depth of the great abyss, held in the prison of the Klepoth, the realm of darkness. Together with this most holy soul at the bottom of the abyss, there dwell the serpents, which torment it and try to seduce it. To these serpents, the holy serpent is over which is the Messiah, for has not the Hebrew word for serpent, Nachash, the same numerical value as the word for Messiah? Mashich, only in the measure in which the process of the tikkun of all the world brings about the selection of good and evil in the depth of the primal space, is the soul of the Messiah freed from its bondage. When the process of perfection on which this soul is at work in its prison, and for which it struggles with the serpents or dragons, is completed, which, however, will not be the case before the end of the tikkun generally, the soul of the Messiah will leave its prison and reveal itself to the world in an earthly incarnation. Thus Nathan